Hi, everyone, and welcome to the annual Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship online seminar. I'm Bob Meyers. I'm president of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. I'm delighted to welcome each and every one of you and all of our viewers in the United States and around the world to today's exciting event. We are an independent, nonprofit membership organization devoted to learning and uncovering the truth behind the Shakespeare authorship issue, especially as it involves Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Not only is truth on our side, but so is grassroots energy and deep dive research. Perhaps the best place to learn about what we are doing and what is available to you is through our webpage, www.shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. Look at the homepage. There you will find up-to-the-minute news articles about events like this one, exclusive video interviews with important researchers, beautifully illustrated articles for experts and novices alike exploring the issue for the first time, educational tools for students and teachers, free access to dozens of Oxfordian publications, and through them, access to thousands of scholarly articles, free information about contests and the prizes they carry, links to our YouTube channel and other social media platforms, podcasts, and much more. In addition, members get these benefits: the ability to attend our new monthly members-only Blue Boar Tavern series, in which scholars and a wise bartender meet for a tankard and candid talk, the 4 times a year newsletter, the ability to tell your own story in print of how I became an Oxfordian. Members are the beating heart of this organization. And let me give you just one example. The first Folio 400 or Quadricentennial Committee consists of Linda Bullard, Roger Stripmatter, Bonner Cutting, and Julie Bianchi, and is chaired by Shelley Maycock. The group will be assisting others at SOF in organizing the 400th year anniversary celebration of Shakespeare's first folio, published in 1623. Highlights will include publication of the Shakespeare Enigma Machine, a book of curated and updated Oxfordian scholarship on the first folio, edited by Roger Stripmatter. A kickoff event in September as part of our annual conference this year in Ashland, Oregon. A celebratory event at the 2023 conference in New Orleans, and coordination with the first folio video contest. Dues from members and donations from members and non-members alike constitute our single largest source of unrestricted revenue. So before I turn you over to John Hamill for a description of today's exciting events, let me do what all presidents do, and that is to encourage you to join or to support us as best you can. So now, here's John, and thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is John Hamill, as Bob said. Thank you, Bob, for that introduction. And it is important, as Bob said, that we become members of the Shakespeare Authorship Fellowship. Without you, we cannot really function. And to let you know that today, we seem to have about over 275 people from around the world joining us who have subscribed for the symposium today. So we have a lot of people. So this is very good news. Again, welcome again to our Zoom presentation for Spring 2008 Symposium. Basically, it's being done now in April because of Oxford's birthday, as close as we can. So we have a symposium in April, then we have a conference in September. Again, I'm John Hamill, former president of the SOF, And during this presentation, just remind everybody that chat function will not be working during the presentations. There'll be a 45-minute break between the first session, the second session. During that 45-minute break, you can use the chat function at that time. However, the question function will be functioning, will be available. So you have questions, please send them in and we will tally them down and we will forward those questions to the presenters. And if we have time at the end of at today's symposium, we'll have the presenters answer the questions. If not, we'll have the presenters respond to them separately. We have a lively set of interesting and educational information to present to you this morning. We will have a 45-minute break at 2:30 Eastern Time. And then at the second session, we will have Don Rubin, who is the Vice President of the Shakespeare Authorship Fellowship. And he will host the second session starting at 3:15 Eastern Time. So there's a 45-minute break. The schedule of today's papers are for the first session. We're going to have 4 papers this morning, or this afternoon, depending where you are in the world. The first one is by Katherine Chiljan. We talked about the first folio fraud. And remember, we're starting to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the first folio, which will culminate next year's conference in New Orleans. The second paper will be from Michael Delahoyde to talk about the Merchant of Venice. The third paper will be from Cheryl Eagan-Donovan about her exploits, her journey, her discoveries when she went to England at the libraries in England about the 16th century poets. And then the last paper before the break will be from James Warren, Building an Oxfordian Library. So our first speaker will be Katherine Chiljan, and I'm very pleased to have her be the first speaker because she will be talking about the first folio, which is the main, what we're trying to center about for this year and for next year. And Katherine Chiljan, as you probably all know, is an independent scholar who studied the Shakespeare authors, who has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for over 3 decades. In 2011, she wrote Shakespeare Suppressed, a marvelous book. If you don't have it, you need to get it. And I entered an award at Concordia University for scholarship. Katherine has debated the subject many times with English professors at the Smithsonian Institution and Mechanics Institute in San Francisco. She has written numerous articles on the topic. And she has an article right now in their newsletter about a potential new portrait we found about Oxford. And in addition to her work, she is a member of the board of directors of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition. So without further ado, here is Katherine Chiljan.
Thank you so much, John Hamill and Don Rubin and Bob Meyers and the whole SOF board for inviting me to speak about the first folio. The first folio is a book containing 36 plays by William Shakespeare, the very first collection. It has 900 large-size folio-sized pages, termed folios. It was registered for publication in November 1623 and released soon afterward. So 2023 will be its 400th anniversary. The first folio was registered for publication in November 1623 and released soon afterward. A second, third, and fourth folio edition followed, all printed in the 17th century. Among the 36 plays, 20 were previously unprinted. They suddenly came into existence with the first folio. It was the greatest event in English literature at the time, and perhaps in history. Without the folio, the world may never have read or known about The Tempest, Macbeth, Taming of the Shrew, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and 15 other Shakespeare plays. The folio also contained the first ever known image of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the most celebrated poet and playwright of the 16th, 17th centuries, and the most prolific, creating plays and poems of great wit and learning, love, wisdom, philosophy, tragedy, history, filled with the most beautiful, majestic, and musical lines in literature. Shakespeare invented over 2,000 new words for the English language. And whether or not we know it, we speak his famous phrases like to be or not to be, brave new world, laughing stock, off with his head, foregone conclusion, into thin air, etc. Shakespeare's works were praised by and influenced his contemporaries, and his impact on artists thereafter cannot be measured. Shakespeare had an incredible breadth of knowledge with a 17,000 word vocabulary of unique words, which was at least twice that of his contemporaries. He was a creative genius whose love for his art, his characters, and humanity pervade his works. The 17th century luminaries certainly thought that the folio was important. King Charles I kept a copy of the folio near his bed and made notes in it. And Sir John Suckling, a poet-playwright himself, posed with the folio in his portrait by Van Dyck. The page is open to Hamlet, as noted by Alexander Waugh. Over 230 copies of the first folio survive today, also attesting to its importance. At first glance, this grand book would inspire the 17th century reader awe, as well as excitement to learn something personal about the great author, which before this book was unknown. Unfortunately for them, the prefatory pages disappointed. They provided no biography of the great author and only hinted at where he lived. Furthermore, it confused the reader with lies and contradiction. This talk will analyze the folio's opening pages, the messages it tried to convey, and how it is the genesis of the Shakespeare authorship controversy. It is based on research in my book, Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth about Shakespeare and his works. The first indication that something was not quite right with the folio was on the title page, which showed a very large and strange engraving of a man. His head is oversized, even deformed, the face gritty and unshaven. The verse opposite, written by poet-playwright Ben Jonson, tells the reader not to look at it. Why then was it included? No other portrait made by the engraver Martin Droeshout depicted a human being so contrary to nature. Droeshout engraved a natural portrait of James, second Marquis of Hamilton, the same year as the Shakespeare engraving, so it was not from his lack of skill. In addition, nothing indicates that this man is a writer. During this period, poets and playwrights were typically portrayed wearing laurel leaves, a sign of poetic victory. Authors were also depicted with writers' tools like pens, books, ink pots. Ben Jonson was portrayed with laurel leaves and books. George Chapman was surrounded by clouds and Latin mottos, one saying, "Here is the glory of Phoebus," a reference to the Greek god of the arts and poetry. Samuel Daniel was portrayed next to two Greek gods, yet the most celebrated poet and playwright in his time had none of this, just a man in gentleman's dress, what I call a gentleman monster. The title page is followed by 14 more preface pages, which I'll go through right here, containing Shakespeare tributes, dedication letter, a letter to the reader, and lists of Shakespeare plays and actors. In his famous folio elegy, Ben Jonson called Shakespeare Sweet Swan of Avon. A few pages after that is Leonard Digges' tribute referring to Shakespeare's Stratford Monument. So we have Avon and Stratford Monument mentioned in a book of Shakespeare plays. And voila, one can deduce that the great author came from the small town of Stratford-on-Avon in Warwickshire. But there are problems with this conclusion. Those who trekked to Stratford-on-Avon to see the Shakespeare Monument, and they did so within 2 years of the folio's release, did not see a writer's monument. They saw a monument to a will dealer called Shakespeare with no first name given, and its effigy of man did not resemble Droeshout's folio engraving. William Dugdale drew the monument in 1634, which was later engraved, and it showed a man holding a wool sack, not today's man holding a pen and paper. The effigy's face was fully bearded and with a drooping mustache, whereas today's effigy sports a goatee and upturned mustache, a style not in fashion in England until the 1620s, which was years after the Stratford man's death. Dugdale's drawing is documentary evidence that the monument was changed after 1634, and obviously it was changed to depict a writer. My research points to circa 1650 when this actually happened. Richard Kennedy's research reveals the original monument was actually that of the Stratford man's father, John Shakespeare, who dealt in wool. There are several differences between Dugdale's drawing and today's monument. Notably, Dugdale's drawing showed leopard heads on the monument, the town's symbol. John Shakespeare served as an official for Stratford-on-Avon, so leopard heads were inappropriate for his monument, but would have been inappropriate for his son, William, who held no town office. The leopard heads disappeared after the monument was changed. What that means is that at the time of the Folio's engraved printing, there was no monument to a writer, Shakespeare, in Stratford-on-Avon. Digges' Stratford Monument may have meant something else or somewhere else. Several towns in England were called Stratford. Digges wrote, "When that stone is rent and time dissolves thy Stratford monument, here we alive shall view thee still." Dissolve means to vanish, but it also meant to do away with as false or erroneous, to refute, confute. Perhaps Digges meant that in time, the fraud in Stratford will be refuted. And when that occurs, those alive will see the true author. Whatever it meant, this piece of folio evidence pointing to the gent in Stratford-on-Avon as the great author was false. Seemingly addressing this very point, Johnson's folio elegy said that Shakespeare was a monument without a tomb. Another meaning of monument is a written document or record. So Johnson may have meant that Shakespeare is a body of writing, not a real person, and therefore would have no need for a tomb. The monument without a tomb line was also Johnson's reply to a then circulating poem by William Bass. Bass fancifully called upon famous dead poets buried in Westminster Abbey to make room for Shakespeare where he should be buried. Johnson said no to the idea. Oddly, in my opinion, Johnson's rebuke was to prevent the reburial of the wrong man, the Stratford man, in the Abbey. The fact that the Stratford man's tomb has no name on it, only a curse, supports this idea. Furthermore, the monument's inscription does not identify the deceased as a poet or playwright. The bewildering line, "Sith all he hath writ, leaves living art but page to serve his wit," does not mean he was a poet playwright. The inscription included, however, the Latin phrase artem minorum, the art of morrow. Morrow was the cognomen of the classical poet Virgil. Only a very literate person would catch this, but regardless, it was inapplicable to Shakespeare, whose art was greatly influenced by the classical poet Ovid, not Virgil. If this monument was meant for a poet, then why not openly state it like Edmund Spenser's tablet in Westminster Abbey, which was inscribed "the Prince of Poets" in his time? Of course, John Shakespeare couldn't write anything. He signed with an X, and as far as known, his son William was illiterate too, with no surviving letters or evidence of education. So the wool trader effigy and all he hath writ are incompatible. This indicates the inscription had been changed to hint the deceased was a writer, but not openly say so. Otherwise, it would confuse locals who knew the Shakespeares. In late 1622, records show that work was done in the chancel area where the monument was located. Dismissing Digges' Stratford monument statement demolishes one of the two pillars of Stratfordianism. The other pillar is Johnson's line, "Sweet Swan of Avon," but that too is not what it seems. Swan was a term for poet during these times. Avon was another name for Hampton Court Palace, as discovered by Alexander Waugh. Royal entertainments were performed there. Thus, the phrase means sweet poet of Hampton Court Palace, totally contrary to the official narrative for the Stratford man who supposedly wrote plays for the public theater. Are we in the 21st century reading too much into these statements? No, because contemporaries hinted that Shakespeare was a nobleman or a man of rank, and that he wrote anonymously or used an alias. The two go hand in hand, as writing plays and poems for the nobility was considered frivolous or déclassé. One example is John Davies of Hereford, who called Shakespeare our English Terence in 1611. At that time, it was believed Terence was a front or pseudonym for two nobleman playwrights. Davies also put a hyphen in Shakespeare, an indication of a made-up name. About half of printed reference to Shakespeare included a hyphen, as seen in the 1603 edition of Hamlet. One contemporary implied Shakespeare wrote as a pastime, not as a profession, and several implied he had died by 1609. Yet the Stratford man was still alive. He died in 1616. Contemporary comments, therefore, and the Folio preface information do not comport. So a closer critical look at the Folio preface is justified, for this book promoted the Stratford man as the great author for the very first time. And what we find are further ambiguities, unverified information, and outright lies, all undermining its credibility. The biggest lie in the Folio preface is in the dedication letter and the letter to the reader, both signed by actors John Hemmings and Henry Condell. The lie was that these letters were not written by them. Ben Jonson wrote them. Scholars have accepted since the 18th century this notion that dedication contains language and images from the classical scholars, writers Pliny and Horace. Hemmings and Condell were neither scholars nor writers. We know that Condell worked as a grocer after he retired from the stage. Jonson, however, was a deep scholar and well-versed in the classics, so much so that he was nicknamed English Horace. Many phrases in the actor's letters to the reader echoes phrases Jonson wrote before and after the Folio. For example, the letter to the reader has the phrase "departed from that right," and that same phrase was used by Jonson in Catiline and Bartholomew Fair. Judge your sixpennyworth, your shilling's worth, your 5 shillings worth at a time or higher was also reflected in Bartholomew Fair with Jonson. Arraign plays daily, an exact phrase used by Jonson in Bartholomew Fair. Another letter to the reader line, "There you are numbered. We had rather you were weighed." And Jonson said in Timber or Discoveries, "Suffrages in Parliament are numbered, not weighed." And then another exact phrase, "How odd soever your brains," in the actor's letter, reflected in Jonson's Timber or Discoveries. Besides Johnsonian echoes, the letters were not complimentary. The dedication opens with Hemmings and Condell saying they are fallen upon the ill fortune of the enterprise, meaning the Folio. They then call Shakespeare's plays trifles 3 times, giving the impression of 2 doofuses who cannot discern great literature. In their letter to the reader, Hemmings and Condell desperately urged the reader to buy the book, evidently to get their money back. It's truly comical. And Jonson was, after all, a comedy writer. The lie that the actors wrote these letters taints the entire preface, calling into question everything it contains. Jonson's elegy to Shakespeare seems to chastise the actors' letters, the ones he covertly wrote. "Shakespeare is above the ill fortune of him," says Jonson, a direct reference to the actor's ill fortune of the Folio enterprise. Jonson says that ignorance, blind affection, and crafty malice are not the way to praise Shakespeare, apparently meaning the 2 actors. Another lie. Hemmings and Condell say they were guardians of the orphan Shakespeare plays. There's no evidence of this, although Hemmings and Condell do appear in the Stratford man's will to receive a small bequest to purchase mourning rings. Hemmings and Condell then contradict their own statements by saying they collected Shakespeare's plays. So which was it? By the way, the Stratford man's will makes no mention of books, theater shares, or unpublished play manuscripts. That the folio was Hemmings and Condell production is contradicted by the end page, which says the book was printed at the charges of Jaggard, the printer, and Edward Blunt, John Smithick, and William Astley, all known publishers. It declares the folio as a business endeavor, not a charity for the orphan plays. The actor's dedication letter says Shakespeare received the favor of the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, and that he was their servant. There is no evidence of this. The letter to the reader says Shakespeare wrote easily. His mind and hand went together, and what he thought he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. This fosters the idea that Shakespeare was a natural genius, that great lines flowed out of him like a psychic doing automatic writing. Johnson contradicts this in his elegy, saying Shakespeare kept revising lines, sweating at the muse's anvil to make them perfect. So richly spun and woven so fit. The actors say the folio preface contributors, who were Johnson, Mab, Holland, and Digges, were Shakespeare's friends. There's no evidence of this. Johnson related an anecdote about Shakespeare in his private papers, but this was years after the Stratford man's death. With the exception of Johnson, these men were minor poets at best and had nothing to do with the theater. Why weren't the tributes made by other dramatists like John Fletcher, Shakespeare's supposed co-author of The Two Noble Kinsmen, who was still alive in 1623? What about dramatists George Chapman and John Marston, also both then alive, who contributed poems along with Shakespeare in the 1601 book Love's Martyr? Returning to the title page, the folio says the play texts are published according to the true original copies. This was also emphasized on the last preface page and Hemmings and Condell's dedication letter, and is clearly false. Several folio play texts were taken from earlier printed editions which contained flaws and misspelling, repeated text, missing text, unclear stage directions, etc., etc. These faults are also found in the 20 previously unpublished folio plays. Another lie, the portrait engraving by Martin Droeshout is the great author's likeness. In 1623, the Stratford man had been dead for 7 years. What was Droeshout's image based upon? It's unknown. Johnson tells the reader not to look at Droeshout's engraving, probably because he knew it was not the real Shakespeare image. Johnson says the true image of Shakespeare is found in his book, meaning the plays, which reveals someone with high learning, a nobleman's point of view, and presumably true life incidents. Another lie. There is no light source in Droeshout's image. Everything is evenly lit. This and the very large image size highlights the two lines at the neck. Together with the wooden face and weird uneven hair, it suggested that the true author is wearing a mask, meaning William Shakespeare is someone's pen name. Another lie is Edward Blunt listed as the folio's printer. Wrong. The book was printed by William Jaggard and his son Isaac. Blunt was the folio's publisher, never a printer. The folio contains all of Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies, says this page. Wrong again. What about Two Noble Kinsmen and Pericles, which were added to the third folio, 1663? What about the now accepted history play Edward III and troublesome reign of King John and the famous victories of Henry V? And 3 others proved as Shakespeare's by Ramon Jimenez in his book, Shakespeare's Apprenticeship. Interestingly, the all reference gets amended to several on this page, the Folio's actors list. Although the Stratford man was a member of the King's Men Acting Company in 1603, there's no lifetime evidence that he actually acted, and the roles he played are unknown. Shakespeare, however, was listed as an actor in Jonson's plays. Sejanus, his fall, and every man in his humor. But that information, like that in the Folio, is posthumous and supplied by Jonson. Another lie is Shakespeare was Jonson's beloved. If the Stratford man was the great author, why then didn't Jonson pen a tribute to his beloved near the time of his death? He had the perfect opportunity to do so in his collected works of 1616, but no, he allowed 7 years to pass. Jonson also censured Shakespeare in a personal conversation with William Drummond. Jonson said, Shakespeare wanted art, meaning he lacked art. Jonson's notes, published after his death, referred to Heming and Condell's supposed statement that Shakespeare never blotted a line. Jonson wrote that Shakespeare should have blotted out 1,000 lines and that Shakespeare redeemed his vices with his virtue. These are hardly remarks made about someone beloved. Another lie is that Shakespeare lacked knowledge of classical writers, classical languages. Jonson in his Folio elegy said to Shakespeare, "And though thou hadst small Latin and less Greek," completely false. Several books and articles detail Shakespeare's deep knowledge of them, including plays which were then untranslated. See Earl Showerman's several articles on this topic. And many words that Shakespeare coined were based on Latin and Greek roots. This lie is so blatant that a 1638 poem questioned it. Speaking of Jonson's good command of Latin, H. Ramsay wrote, "That which your Shakespeare scarce could understand." But Jonson's line could be read another way. In context, Jonson wanted to call forth to life again the classical dramatists Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, and others, so Shakespeare could hear their praise of his great plays, even if he had small Latin and less Greek. The knowing reader would read it that way. The unknowing reader would think Shakespeare was classically deficient, which jives with Heming's and Condell's letter implying Shakespeare was a natural genius. What's left out of the Folio's preface? A biography of the great author. Not even the year he died was given, just says that he's dead. Shakespeare was also a great poet. His poems, Venus and Adonis, The Rape of Lucrece, and the sonnets were wildly popular during his lifetime, but they were left unmentioned in the Folio preface. Composition dates of Shakespeare's plays were also left out, or an order of composition. To this day, it's not known with certainty when any Shakespeare play was written. If the great author were the Stratford man, here are notable exceptions. His coat of arms, not there. Other writers were portrayed with him. Notice that he was a member of the King's Men Acting Company, or the Lord Chamberlain's men, which Orthodox scholars believe he was. Also missing was an image of his supposed monument in Stratford-on-Avon. Also missing was the phrase Stratford upon Avon. Numerous English towns had the name Avon or Stratford in them, so it would have been essential to really put the entire phrase. With 5 large blank pages in the preface, there was certainly room to add any of this information. The lies in the Folio's preface support a certain message that it apparently wished to convey. That the great author was from humble origins, a friend and fellow of actors Hemings and Condell, that he came from a small Warwickshire town of Stratford-on-Avon, that he was an unlearned, natural genius. Yet Johnson contradicted this in the Folio, where he called Shakespeare gentle 3 times. Gentle meant born into gentility or nobility, which did not apply to the Stratford man. Johnson also hinted that Shakespeare was a descriptive pen name with the phrase shake a lance, punning on spear in Shakespeare, emphasizing spear shaking, which was the sport of jousting. Shakespeare was hyphenated several times in the Folio's preface, indicating a made-up name. Of course, the Stratford man's surname never included a hyphen, and the Stratford man's name was spelled almost always without the E in shake. So it was surely pronounced Shakespeare, not Shakespeare. That the Folio preface was questionable or fraudulent is not just a 21st century viewpoint. Within a year of the Folio's release in 1624, a brave author hinted at a sham. Gervase Markham, in honor in his perfection, wrote that Vere was omitted from a recently published book, A Pretty Secret or Mystery. Vere cannot be omitted. To quote, only in the story there is one pretty secret or mystery which I cannot let pass untouched, because it brings many difficulties or doubts into the mind of an ignorant reader, and that is the mistaking of names. Vere's name was mistaken with another's in the story, meaning a book, and the mistaken name was one that people knew was associated with Vere. He described this Vere as a great virtue, and himself as the least spark of virtue that is. Virtue is a talent, and Markham's talent was soldiery and writing. No Vere soldier had an associative name, but a Vere writer did. Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, a recognized poet and playwright and patron of acting companies. Contemporaries said that Oxford wrote anonymously, and Gabriel Harvey, in a public speech in Latin, said Oxford's will shakes spears. The recently published, in another work, Harvey hinted that William Shakespeare was a pen name. So did author Edmund Spenser, who described a great courtier poet who had a warlike name, which could only be the spear shaker Shakespeare. The Earl of Oxford was a champion jouster at age 21, so Shakespeare would have been an apt pseudonym for him. The recently published Vere book with the mistaken name that Markham complained about, therefore, was Shakespeare's first folio. Markham wrote a brief tribute to Oxford in the paragraph just before this comment, but left out mention of his literary or dramatic works, achievements. He only wrote that he was learned, pious, and magnanimous. Markham said the mistaking of names injured Vere and accused a certain pen for it. In this quote, the least spark of virtue which is, meaning Markham, cannot choose but repine, meaning complain, when it finds a great virtue injured by a pen whose blanching might make the whole world forgetful. Markham likely meant Ben Jonson's pen, who was behind the fraud of Hemming's and Condell's letters. By the mistaking of names, Markham meant Vere's pen name was used instead of his real name, which might make the whole world forgetful of him. He was proved right. Nearly 300 years passed before J.T. Loney discovered that the 17th Earl of Oxford was the true Shakespeare. A blatant criticism of the first folio occurred in 1640 in a book of Shakespeare's poems. It featured an altered version of Droshat's engraving, a more human-looking face. And bay leaves were added, which Droshat left out. A verse below it questioned Droshat's image. This shadow is renowned Shakespeare's? Soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of the stage. These were quotes from Jonson's folio elegy. So the anonymous writer's questions were aimed directly at Johnson, though he was then deceased. Shakespeare orthodoxy usually takes at face value Hemming's and Condell's comments that the Folio was their enterprise and stops there. Yet the expense for such a production would have been enormous. Even if Blount, Jaggard, Smith, and Astley were contributing partners, it's estimated, even if they were contributing partners, it's estimated that 750 copies were made of this 900 big-paged book. The bulk of the Folio production expenses, therefore, must have come from its dedicatees, the Herbert brothers, the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery. Pembroke is on the left and Montgomery is on the right, which I hope you're seeing these slides. Pembroke was one of the richest men in England and one of the most powerful. The brother Earls also had connections with the Folio's publisher, Edward Blunt, and preface contributors Ben Jonson and Leonard Digges. Jonson was greatly beholden to Pembroke. Pembroke patronized Jonson's works in 1616, gave him money to buy books, and got him a royal annuity of £66. He even wrote a letter to Oxford University recommending Jonson for an honorary degree, which happened. Folio publisher Edward Blunt had dedicated a translation to Pembroke and Montgomery and published one of Jonson's plays. Leonard Digges had dedicated a translation to Pembroke and Montgomery, which was published by Blunt. Folio contributor James Mabb was good friends with Blunt, and Folio contributor Hugh Hullen was friends with Jonson. Martin Droeshout's uncle was associated with Marcus Garretts, who made a portrait of the Earl of Montgomery. Notice how none of the Folio contributors were associated with Hemmings and Condell, with the exception of Ben Jonson. Moreover, Digges, Holland, and Mabb had zero theater connections. All were university educated, however, so it's likely that they were hired to edit the Shakespeare plays for the Folio. In late 1615, Pembroke was appointed the King's Lord Chamberlain, which controlled the Revel's office. This meant he had total control of the theater and play publication. Strangely, from that point onward, Shakespeare play publication stopped. There were, however, 2 occasions when publishers issued a Shakespeare play, and each time Pembroke issued a halting order through the Stationers' Company. This was actually predicted in 1609. An anonymous letter to the reader in Shakespeare's play Troilus and Cressida warned that Shakespeare's comedies will soon be out of print, alluding to the wills of the grand possessors. The Shakespeare plays, therefore, were controlled by others in 1609, not by the great author. This implied that he was then dead. His property would naturally have passed to his family members, who apparently were grand people of rank and power. This letter was addressed to the ever reader, meaning, in my opinion, the E. Vere, Edward de Vere reader. The Earl of Montgomery was a member of Oxford's family. He married Oxford's youngest daughter, Susan, shortly after his 1604 death. The Earl of Pembroke was nearly engaged to Oxford's second daughter, Bridget. They certainly qualified as the grand possessors. Clearly, Pembroke was interested in controlling the Shakespeare plays, yet his involvement in the Folio's production is never explored by Shakespeare orthodoxy, or that he may have been its initiator. If that was the case, then the lies, ambiguities, and contradictions in the preface were all made with his approval. What was the brothers' purpose with the misleading Folio preface? Evidently, they wanted to control Shakespeare's image, to dispel the notion that William Shakespeare was someone's pen name, as believed by some before the folio's release. The title page's large image purporting to be a man born William Shakespeare screamed this to the reader. In addition, the folio tried to fill in the great author's personality void to dispel the notion that William Shakespeare was someone's pen name. They wanted to reform his image away from the highly ranked scholarly author who wrote plays as a pastime into a professional author, a professional actor, friends and fellows of actors Hemmings and Condell, a writer of natural genius, unlearned in the classics, associated with Avon and Stratford, and having a monument in Stratford. By turning Shakespeare into a man of humble origins with no court connections means he could not write satirically about real courtiers. Like the powerful Lord Burleigh, who was lampooned as the wily counselor Polonius in Hamlet. Oxford was Lord Burleigh's son-in-law. He was the only playwright who knew him intimately, and the only playwright who could survive writing such a portrayal. The Stratford man, as the great author, would decontextualize everything Shakespeare wrote, including the sonnets, which were clearly written by a nobleman, and seemed to reveal secrets touching upon the succession of Queen Elizabeth I. The Stratford man was the perfect decoy because he was not only born William Shakespeare, he was involved in the theater. Surviving records, however, suggest his involvement was merely financial as a moneylender to acting companies and as a theater investor. Why the brother Earls did this may never be completely known, but it had to be for a very, very important reason to go to such lengths and expense. It must have been for the same reason that Oxford's death in June 1604 was met with complete silence, even though he was one of the highest ranked men in England. Not even still living authors of books dedicated to Oxford mentioned it. In fact, Oxford was covertly disparaged in the comedy Westward Ho in 1605 by Thomas Dekker and John Webster. Even as late as 1640 appeared this anonymous statement, "Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise." During his lifetime, Oxford was silent about his connection to the Shakespeare plays, and some evidence suggests he tried to stop his works from being printed. This was to protect his family name, and its literary peers respected his wishes, although they still made cryptic remarks hinting it was the great author. After Oxford's death, however, to be openly credited with the Shakespeare plays would have been completely respectable and for others to say so. But this did not happen. The courtier poet, for example, Sir Philip Sidney, had nothing published in his name while alive, but after he died, his sister, the Countess of Pembroke, published his Arcadia with his name on it. In the folio, De Vere was robbed of this glory. Although we thank the Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery for giving the world Shakespeare's first folio and all those previously unknown plays, we grieve that they allowed its preface to foster the greatest hopes in literature. If this book had never been printed, no one would have connected the great author with the Stratford man. In essence, the first folio preface was another piece of fiction orchestrated by Ben Jonson, in my opinion. Jonson knew the Stratford man as he spoofed him as a character in two of his comedies, as a commoner desperate to be a gentleman. In one of them, Every Man in His Humor, Jonson seemed to describe the Droschat portrait in a line added to the play's 1616 version. An accomplished monster or miracle of nature. A miracle of nature would help explain how a completely uneducated man, the Stratford man, churned out great works of literature. Francis Beaumont made a similar comment about Shakespeare in a verse addressed to Jonson before 1616. Shakespeare will be the example to students, he said, of how far sometimes a mortal man may go by the dim light of nature. This scheme was apparently planned while the Stratford man was still alive. In closing, upon the 400th anniversary of the Folio, it would be fitting that the world, and especially academia, would recognize the Stratford man hoax contained in the Folio. Only then can begin a whole new world of new Shakespeare research and discovery. Thank you, and happy birthday, the Earl of Oxford.
Thank you, Katherine, for a great introduction to our 400th anniversary of the Folio. You have brought out so many problems with the Folio, illustrate the lies the Folio has, and all the complexities of why this is still such an issue. This is a great introduction, again, to the first Folio for this year and next year, which we need to concentrate on what the problems with the Folio are, why it's still under discussion. So thank you again, Katherine. Now, our next speaker is Michael Delahoyde, and he'll be talking about when shall we laugh in Oxford's Merchant of Venice? Never. And I think with Michael Delahoyde, we'll be laughing. You can't avoid that. And Michael has a great background. He's a professor of English for 30 years at Washington State University. He teaches Shakespeare, mythology, interdisciplinary arts, and humanity courses. He carried undergraduate degrees in English, music, education at Vassar College, and a PhD in English literature at the University of Michigan. Michael has published articles of Chaucer, dinosaur films, children's stories, meatheads. Michael is like a Renaissance man. He knows a little bit about everything. He's really, truly a rounded person. Anyway, he's written extensively about Oxford in the last 20 years. And he's a senior editor of the MLA Journal, the Rocky Mountain Review, for 14 years, and is managing editor of the Brief Chronicles is also. Anyway, here is Michael Delahoyde. Without further ado, thank you, Mike.
I'm doing too much today, so probably most of it badly. But primarily, I want to correct this consensus about the Merchant of Venice and the need to apologize for the thing. But also, because of the 400th anniversary, I am interested in the first Folio oddities. There are mostly the paginations, which seem to be errors or the result of hastiness, are not. And I'm convinced and have been convinced that mathematics, sacred mathematics, geometry, and other matters esoteric are involved. I want to make some Venice connections and ultimately an Oxfordian edition to come out of this. After Twelfth Night recently, I'm about halfway through an edition of the Comedy of Errors that I'm producing in collaboration with Jennifer Newton. But I've already started an edition of The Merchant of Venice too, because I think it's important that we get this one Oxfordian. All right, first, Shakespeare he has this addiction to interdisciplinary matters. And in Twelfth Night, this reference to the picture of we three is obscure and not visual, but basically it's a joke reference to some image where you'd have two jackasses and you look at it and the title is We Three and you think, wait a minute, hey, I got that because you're the third. So it's kind of an involvement in the art. It is the early version of optical illusion art from the 60s where artists try to get a 3D effect or kind of a buzzing motion effect on the canvas. For Shakespeare, he in Italy would have seen these illusions, this fake art where you're not probably convinced that you're seeing through a skylight, but you might be convinced that you're seeing a dome or a 3D image, and you're not, it's flat. They might have called it anamorphosis to be fancy, but perspective art is the term that keeps coming up. And you know that Shakespeare loves this because he refers to it again and again. When the twins get together at the end of Twelfth Night, it's like, wait a minute, what? There's two of them? It's like a perspective. Or for Cleopatra, you look at Antony one way and he's like a monster, but another way, he's a god of war. Here's an example from the 16th century where you take a stiff piece of paper or cardboard and accordion fold it, and in every other slat, you can draw Mary, Queen of Scots, And then in the other ones, you put a skull there, and aren't we clever? So depending on where you're positioned and where you're looking at it, you see something different. Patrick Hughes, I think, is still working in the current mode where if you are, this is actually an installation. If you are on one side, you're seeing mostly door. And as you walk over, you'll see the doors kind of shrink and then you're seeing mostly outside. Another interesting phenomenon about this, though, is that you'd swear to God those doors are moving. In Henry V, whether Henry's seeing the princess or he's seeing cities, depends on how you view him. Shakespeare says in Sonnet 24 that this is the coolest thing that painters can do. It's a special effect that you can get in art. And he comes out in Richard II most clearly about what he's talking about here. Perspectives, which rightly gazed upon, show nothing but confusion. But if you look at things the right way, you'll see what you're supposed to. Is this just a goofy experiment? It's like Magic Eye a few years ago, where this elongated Edward VI has to be viewed from the side if you're going to see anything clear. Now, especially in Mantua, northern Italy, Shakespeare would have seen Giulio Romano. You know, he's the one artist Shakespeare ever mentions by name in The Winter's Tale. Giulio Romano does this stuff all over the place. This is just a cheesy little alleyway, but you'd swear that there's scalloping going on there, and it's not. It's absolutely flat. You got to stand in the right place to see it, but it's absolutely flat. I went to the Palazzo del Te and saw the Room of the Horses. Big deal. And it wasn't until I revisited it and stood in the right place where I realized, wait a minute, that's not just a flat painting, I thought suddenly. Now it looks like it's a statue on a ledge, but it's not. It is a flat painting, just made to look like it's 3D. Same with these statues, flat. And this cathedral, later than Shakespeare could have seen, but it's a really good example of what they were working on in Italy, where you would swear you could reach out and touch some of these figures. Others are a mile away. Realize, though, you have to be standing in the right place for the 3D effect. If you got to go up and touch up St. Peter's nose and you get the scaffolding up there, everything's going to be out of whack. So here are some modern crude examples. You look at it one way, or another way. And these famous interwebs things where you can see these illusions. This is actually Mantua. Wasn't there when I was, but I didn't realize. I saw this image a long time ago. Never realized, hey, I walked on there. I probably had an Aperol spritz along there somewhere. So to here, and here we've got a famous image from the 16th century where we seem to be celebrating all our accomplishments. And students these days can figure out what that blob is down below, because I think we are more flexible with our visual knowledge or visible, abilities, and they'll realize, okay, that's a skull. But at the time, you probably had to look at it askew to be reminded that these are the mere things of this earth. Think about your soul. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because I think Shakespeare would have seen this special effect and would have thought, how can I get this in literature, in drama, and theater? And he succeeded. Henry V, you look at it one way, and the predominant way, and people will say this is a hero-worshiping, flag-waving, nationalistic, glorious play about the best king ever. But you got to ignore some of these features, and you look at it another way, and you realize this is an expose of the most soulless, imperialist bastard who ever walked the face of the earth and killed his friends. Taming of the Shrew. Oh, we so want this to be sexist because Shakespeare was a man of his time, and that's just the way people thought about women. No, you look, that's the consensus. You look at it another way, and you're missing what is really revealed in that. I'm doing a presentation, I hope, in the fall for the SOF in the conference about this one, and trying to correct some misinterpretations about that one too. And now we come to Merchant of Venice. Here, well, alas, Shakespeare was a man of his time, and he hated Jews, and probably was pretty racist too. Didn't seem like that in all the other plays, nor did he seem like a sexist in all the other plays. But, what are you going to do except apologize for him and say he's excused because it was 400 years ago and everybody thought that. There's no excuse. Just because you were born 400 years ago doesn't mean you can be shitty to other people. And, what's Jesus's excuse for not conforming to his period too? So no, you're not off the hook. And Shakespeare is not what we are insisting on, like Harold F. Bloom here, who says in his chapter about Merchant of Venice, one would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb not to recognize that Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice is profoundly anti-Semitic work. So you'd have to be blind, I guess, like you couldn't see or read the play, or deaf, you couldn't hear the play, and dumb, you couldn't speak, so you couldn't appreciate. Oh, I get it. He's making a pun about stupidity and at the expense of people with an affliction. Fantastic. Well, that's really sensitive. Pile. The consensus that Shakespeare here essentially belongs to his age just this once in regard to the Jews. And I've seen this among critics and students too. We just want Shakespeare to be sexist and anti-Semitic and racist. Is it that, it can make us feel superior in one way to Shakespeare or what? But we're clinging to it. And I'm here to tell you, no, it doesn't work. So there's the quarto, and here's Merchant of Venice, the beginning in the first folio, starting on page 163. We come off of Midsummer Night's Dream in 162, and we go to Merchant of Venice 163, and we turn the page and it's 162 and 163 again. Okay, and then we're back on track with 166 and 167. Well, that's weird. Actually, if you back up, you go from 160 to 163 to 162 to 163. And what does this mess up? Well, people throw up their hands and say, yeah, he screwed up. Errors in pagination. But I don't believe in it. So if you check out my 12th night edition and look at the errors in pagination there at a significant point, you'll see what I'm starting to get at here. And I've only scratched the surface of this, so I don't really know for sure how deep this goes. However, 162 is an interesting number to keep repeating and getting into this cycle of, because it's useful in cryptography. It's got some special mathematical names too. And 163 especially, which we seem to be insisting on, is considered a lucky prime. It figures in ratios that calculate close to pi and E, and then we're off. Here we go. But it's also interesting for this context. Apparently, the number of days that you count from the start of Passover to calculate when is Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, right? Coincidence, or what are we doing? There's more and no time. Now, into the play. We start off in this so-called comedy. In sooth, I know why I am so sad. A guy who's completely depressed and says, I don't even know myself, which is a perfect sign that Shakespeare is playing with identity, knowing yourself, and that this guy is off base somehow. Bassanio shows up and says, first thing he says, good seniors both, when shall we laugh? Like we're forcing we just have to have fun, and it's not going to happen. The whole play is just melancholy and weary, and it seems as if people are straining to amuse themselves. And I think audiences do this too. It's like there's a built-in laugh track, and they think, oh, this was funny back in the day, so I'm supposed to laugh. And there's nothing funny in this play. Second scene, first thing that Portia says, I'm weary too. And I wonder, what's wrong with these people? Is it just what we used to say in the 80s that, when yuppies whine about how unhappy they are or unsatisfied, it's like affluenza? Well, Nerissa isn't taking it. You would be weary if your miseries were in the same abundance as your good fortunes are. And Portia says, pretty snotty, good sentences and well pronounced. And Nerissa sticks with it. Yeah, they'd be better if you listen to the substance of this stuff. Good sentences and well pronounced is a handy phrase because we've got the language of trials coming, legal matters. We've got blurry language with romance and economics. So good sentences and well pronounced is something to keep in mind as her philosophy. All right, second act, you've got this young Lancelot Gobbo who does a kind of a stand-up thing, which is really painful to watch, I think, but people say, oh, ha, 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 it's really amusing. However, so you got his stand-up, then he plays a practical joke on his blind father. That's hilarious. Portia's going to mock national stereotypes in a moment and people's accents. We mock the elderly. There's a reference to a chimp. That's always fun. No, it's disgusting. And then there's these puns that even a character in the play will say when Lancelot gets a Moorish woman pregnant, and he says, oh, well, the more for me. And he starts punning on more. And even the character Lorenzo in the play says, any jackass can pun on that. So undermining every time there's some sort of comedy in this play is what you can trace. The party that we build up to, where Jessica is going to be in disguise and the young men are going to come around, she's going to elope, and we're all partying because it's Venice and we got masks on and there's going to be music and fun. And some character comes on and says, yeah, it's all off because it's too windy tonight. Undermined every time. By the way, when Lancelot shows up, there's a lot of oddities in the first folio. All I will say about this one is that editors will change this. Whiter than the paper it writ on is the fair hand that writ. But the folio has I, the fair hand that writ. All right, so I already mentioned Portia mocking all of these international suitors, a situation that only Elizabeth would appear to be relevant with. And then the Prince of Morocco, he's the first guy who's going to pick a box to try to win Portia. The first thing he says, mislike me not for my complexion. He picks the wrong box and leaves, and Portia says, good riddance. Let all of his complexion choose me so. Well, sounds kind of racist. Is Shakespeare supporting this? The people sticking to the anti-Semitic Shakespeare will say, yeah, absolutely, see? And we're supposed to ignore that too, because Shakespeare loves Portia's most wonderful creation. And Harold Bloom himself needs to strap on the drool bucket when he talks about her, it just in these glowing terms that she's so magnificent. But there are some problems. Now we meet, also in the first act, Shylock, who is invited to dinner by Bassanio. And he says, no, to eat of the habitation which your prophet, the Nazarite, conjured the devil into? No. Now, this is interesting because he's referring to an early miracle of Jesus where Jesus drives out a bunch of demons possessing a guy and into a herd of swine who stampede and jump off a cliff, which makes me think, well, aren't the demons going to come out of their dead bodies then? And we're even in worse shape, but I don't understand these matters. Anyway, the interesting thing is that, well, not that Shylock got this wrong. It's not that Christians shouldn't eat pork because Jesus, no. However, what is interesting is that Shylock has puzzled about the New Testament, or this event in the New Testament. He has explored the enemy text. And that is something certainly that these so-called Christians in the play have not done. Now, he's going to lend Antonio the money. But Antonio says, you know what? If you lend me the money, that's fine. But we're making a deal here where I'm still going to spit on you and spurn you and kick you and call you a dog. So take it or leave it. And Shylock says, look how you storm. I would be friends with you and have your love. Forget the shames that you have stained me with. Supply your wants and take nothing of usance, no usury for my money. And you're not here. This is kindness I offer. This is kind I offer. Now, if you despise Shylock from the start and you go in with your prejudices, you're going to think, he's tricking them. He's like suckering them in, all that. And you can find lines that make Shylock absolutely reprehensible. But what if right here, he is just pointing out, look at the irony of this situation. You're coming to me for money, and yet you treat me like crap. And look, I'm going to give you the money. I'm not even going to charge you interest. And this is kindness I offer. Bassanio, standing right there, says to Antonio, this is kindness. And Antonio says, no, this is rubbish. And he just gets absolutely vicious at Shylock. Was this a moment where Shylock was trying to teach them something and it just got absolutely stomped out? I think so, because there's an exactly similar moment in Henry V where Henry gets his gift from the Dauphin. What is it? It's tennis balls. And he goes off about, how he's going to be bashing the brains of children for generations of the French because of this joke. And his uncle, after this diatribe, says, this was a merry message, and usually delivered with this heavy irony. This was a merry message. But what if he was saying, what in hell is wrong with you? This was a joke gift, and you're flying off the handle. Well, same thing, I think, in Merchant of Venice, if you're willing to offer a little tolerance here. Here's proof that Shylock is horrible, because his own daughter says, our house is hell. And how old is she? What, 15? A 15-year-old saying our house is hell? Is that testimony that's going to hold up in court? Shylock's going to go to this party and leave her behind, and she's going to elope, and we're tugged back and forth. Uh-oh, he's thinking about not going. Oh, thank God he's going. Uh-oh, he's thinking about not going. And one of the moments he thinks about not going is there's some ill brewing towards, I did dream of money bags. See, typical Jew, thinking of money all the time, avariciously. No, look at that more carefully. He dreams of money bags, and that's a bad sign to him. It's not about the money. When he finds out that his daughter has absconded and robbed him blind, he's running around the streets, absolutely horrified, my daughter and my ducats. This is reported by some dunces in the play. And, he's mocked by these kids too. And the interpretation is, well, see, he can't even distinguish from his own flesh and blood from his money. But is that really the case, or is it just the horror? I mean, my stupid brother stole from my parents, and it was just devastating to them psychologically. So give the guy a break, please. And besides, later on, he says, would she were at my foot. Oh, my God. He wants his own daughter dead and the ducats in the coffin. It's not about the money. It's the whole horror, the mind-blowing horror of this, and he wants it all gone. Is he literally bloodthirsty for a victim here? All right, second guy opens up a box, gets it wrong, and gets a picture of a blinking idiot. As for Shylock's main speech, I don't know how you're going to reconcile this if you have gone into this play insisting that he's an absolute villain. But it's this famous speech. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. And I just realized that's pretty cool. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and I will better the instruction. In other words, revenge. Payback. A money thing. And he doesn't use the money language. And I will better the instruction with interest. I will pay you back with interest for what you've done. Now, more important than that is one of these jokers he's speaking to should have interrupted him somewhere and said, there's where you're wrong, Jew. But they don't. And that says a lot. Where should they have interrupted him? Well, if a Jew wrong a Christian, what's going to happen? Christians will get revenge. And somebody should have had the Christian understanding to say, no, that's not what Christianity is about. It's about forgiveness. But they don't, because they're lunkheads and they don't understand their own religion, much less have any tolerance for learning anything about anybody else's. Afterwards, this Tubal character, this is creepy. He tells Shylock that Antonio has had some losses. Oh, that's good. Your daughter blew a ton of money. Oh my God, no. Yeah, but Antonio, he's having bad luck. Ooh, that's good. But your daughter, she bought a monkey. Oh, that's horrible. And she took one of your late wife's rings and sold it for, oh no, that's, and he goes back and forth with Antonio, your daughter, Antonio, your daughter. This has been seen as post-hypnotic torture. Shylock actually says, you're torturing me, Tubal, to hear about what my daughter's doing with this extravagances. And this Tubal is disappears as just this creepy, shadowy figure in the back. Well, Bassanio picks the right box and he opens it up. And what's there? Fair Portia's counterfeit, which I guess everybody assumes means that that's a possessive apostrophe rather than a contraction. Fair Portia is counterfeit. And I got to say, yes. Finally, Act 4, the big time, Shylock meets Shyster. In she comes with her identity theft, which is supposed to be so delightful, and says that the quality of mercy is not strained. It drops as a gentle heaven, and everybody goes ooh and ah for Portia. But what is this mercy and forgiveness and gentility going to amount to when it's time to squash Shylock? It's going to be good sentences and well pronounced, and nothing about mercy. I don't want to push this too far, but I'm curious. I've seen lots of different productions of this. And when the Duke initially addresses Shylock, he says, we all think that you're going to do the right thing and, you make your point and then not follow through here. Right, Jew? I expect a gentle answer. And he says, well, a gentle answer is not in my bond. But I've seen different productions where it seems as if it might have been, was Shylock really going to go through with this? This edition will have him go for it, stop, shake, back up, and then he really goes for it before Portia says, tarry a little. But there are other ones where you wonder, is he just trying finally again to make a point with these Christians? And it never works, and they immediately shut him down. And what is the sadistic thing going on when Portia finally realizes, tarry a little? Did the Holy Spirit of law just finally come down on her and she realizes, wait, there's a flaw here? Or did she wait for that moment because she knew what she was going to do? Well, nobody thinks about that because it's such high drama at the moment. All right, so we obliterate Shylock and we never see him again for the entire Act 5. Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is laid with patens of bright gold. Isn't that romantic? Evening in Italy. Patens of bright gold. Those would be little metal discs. Now, I'm going to zip through this from being in Venice, where I saw these guys, who I always think are crooked. Paul Edmondson knew there was an Oxfordian in the room. Didn't like the stink of that. But Stanley Wells was all right. Anyway, there's a production where Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the Duke, playing the Duke a few years ago in Venice, because it was the 500th anniversary of the Jewish ghetto. So you could see a production there. Anyway, as you may remember or know, in Venice, Colleen Moriarty and I found these documents where Oxford's trying to get into and see these private chambers where, if you're up against the Concilio de Dieci, this might be your last view of the world, because you were a traitor and they condemned you, you go to prison and they kill you. What's taken us so long? Anyway, Oxford wanted to get into these places. And as I confess in an upcoming newsletter article, I'm still trying to work on this and find, are there connections between the art and the works of Shakespeare? And I wonder about this one. I don't want to push it too far, but this one's called In the Concilio de Dieci. Oxford would have seen this in 1575. Juno showering grace upon Venice. Grace, that's cold, hard cash coming down there. And that's the way Venice thinks of itself, just reveling in not just the money, but something about the aesthetics of the wealth too. And so when this character looks up in heaven and sees patens of bright gold, is he talking about the stars are like coins up there? All right. And then finally, Portia comes home and talks about, isn't that weird how the light is so faint, but when a big light comes around, it basically eclipses it. And you could think about, okay, is that the way we're thinking about Judaism versus Christianity? But she also goes on with these other odd analogies. The crow doth sing as sweetly as the lark when neither is attended. In other words, if you didn't have larks around to compare with, a crow going, ah, would sound like a really good song. I know, let's get rid of dissenting voices, and then the rubbish that we spew, there's nothing to compare it to. So it's going to be fine. And we got rid of Shylock. And there's even a reference to eclipsing, getting rid of. And then finally, you got the rings where, the rings have just gone in a ring and circle and nobody betrayed anybody. And it's a big joke, but it's also a symbol of this insulated group that you can never break into. You're always on the outside. And I just decide that we've got a conspiracy of faux Christian economic tyrants obliterating the dissenting voice and offering no perspective on any of this. I don't think we're appreciating Shakespeare enough. You might remember Ian Haste coming up with this. Vera is a specific term for a wedding ring in Venice, but the plural would be vir. So why do you have this superfluous couple, the superfluous final ring that you get here, Nerissa's ring? Now, I don't want to push this last bit too much, but because it's not the only time Nerissa is spelled with 2 R's, but this weird faith. It's supposed to be keeping safe Nerissa's ring. It's not the only time we have this F for an S either. But I am told, and I can't say this with confidence, is it an anagram for Sephiron Sephiros, which is another Jewish calendar designation involving marriages and rings. But actually, it's not, because if you do the work there, you realize, oh, it's missing an I. All right, never mind. So is Minerva Britannia missing an I. And you might remember that this bit with the code, thy name is Devere, almost we have an I there, but maybe it's not there. And there's a lot of debate about that. Shakespeare's sonnets, why isn't there a number 1? Did they run out of ones already on the first page? It's like they could have used an I, unless they were missing that too. Here's a crummy poem. It ends with lies and my mistress's eye. It should be eyes. It's missing an I. It's like the missing eye of Horus, And these ancient Egyptians, they are such plagiarists, where you got this nephew who must avenge the death of his father against his uncle. As long as we're in Egypt, what's missing on the top of that? If it ever is, there's a debate there. But the proto Freemasons seem to know something about that. Whatever secret societies are going on. And, I, there's the rub. In the first folio, it's the letter I, there's the rub. It's like the ego. And here, Richard II needs to get rid of his I too. He's saying, oh, no. Is he going to give back the crown? No. I know no I, maybe, is what the pun is. Knowing no I, for I must nothing be. Is this what every enlightened being has always said? Get rid of the ego, and it's all one. So are we underappreciating Shakespeare and his being enlightened? And I'm convinced that that's what's happening. But I got a lot more work to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael, for a very, very insightful presentation of Merchant of Venice and why it is such a controversial play even to this day. You brought up many issues that we need to consider. And also remind everybody that Michael has 2 books, above 2 books, and Oxfordian versions of Cleopatra and Twelfth Night. Those are very, very good books with a lot of information and lots of insights. And so I urge you to purchase those books. Again, Cleopatra and Twelfth Night, edited by Michael Delahoyde. And also Michael went on a tour of Italy when the Shakespeare Authorship Fellowship funds to research Oxford's dealings in Northern Italy and also all his artwork. So that's part of it. Part of that is a result of that trip. Of those trips, he did several trips. So now we're going to move over to Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, who also went on a Shakespeare Authorship Fellowship tour of England to research on at the library about authors of the 16th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Let me give a little bit of background on Cheryl. She is a MFA filmmaker, educator, whose documentary, Nothing is Truer Than Truth. I urge you, all of you, to look into it. If you haven't seen it already, we have it on our website. Nothing is Truer Than Truth. It's available on Amazon Prime in the US and Canada, and it's also going to be released in Europe pretty soon. And with a different name, Shakespeare, the Man Behind the Name. She was at Oxford Shakespeare Author Fellowship Oxfordian of the Year in 2019. and she served on the boards of both the Shakespeare Authorship Fellowship, Women in Film Video in New England, and the Next Door Theater. She teaches writing, film, and literature at Leicester University, and is currently working on a book for screenwriters, Shakespeare Author, creating authentic characters for the screen. And she and I are working on a book, which will maybe come out sometime soon. And she is a frequent lecturer at conferences at universities, and most recently presented her work at the 2021 National Council of Teachers of English Annual Conference. So here is Cheryl.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to the SOF for inviting me to speak today. I'm just going to share my screen, if I may. So today I would like to talk about my recent trip to London that was supported very generously by the SOF Research Grant Program. I'm just going to give you basically an overview of the preliminary findings of my trip. And in addition to the Research Grant Committee, I would like to thank Bonner Miller Cutting, Alexander Waugh, and Roger Strittmatter for their recommendations. When looking for Shakespeare in London, you might find him in Leicester Square, the entertainment district, or over in Bishopsgate at the Bull, or perhaps at the Savoy, which is now part of the theater district. I spent 7 days in August 2021, and I visited the British Library, the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, and the archives at Dulwich College, where I viewed and transcribed several manuscripts pertaining to the 17th Earl of Oxford and many of the poets in his literary circle. I viewed the Harleian and Lansdowne collections housed at the British Library, the Rawlinson manuscript collection at the Bodleian, which of course includes Oxford's extant poetry, and I also viewed the Edward Allen collection, including Robert Greene's Orlando Furioso and Henslow's diary and accounts books at Dulwich College. Let's see. It was really quite a miracle that I was able to get there and back in August, because the COVID restrictions and testing requirements were changing all the time. There was finally a window at the very end of August where the 10-day quarantine requirement was lifted. I also had to deal with my flight being changed several times, and I had to get in and out of London before my classes started at the university at Lesley. So I left Boston at 6 a.m. on Sunday, August 22nd, flew right into Hurricane Henry at JFK International in New York, where we were delayed for 2 hours on the tarmac. But the flight was uneventful once we took off, and landed in London at 2200 hours Greenwich Mean Time and arrived at my hotel at midnight. I stayed at a hotel that was just 5 minutes from the library, perfect location at King's Cross in St. Pancras. And my hotel room itself was quite small, not much bigger than a closet. No housekeeping services due to COVID, but there was a big bright lobby where I could actually open my laptop, and they had a nice European breakfast and fresh coffee every day. The pub next door is a famous music venue called the Water Rats Today, where Bob Dylan made his UK debut, and the Pogues and Oasis played their first live shows in London. It was previously known as the Pindar of Wakefield. It was across the street, built in 1517, and this is on Gray's Inn Road. The British Library has a wonderful collection. It's a very modern building with the stacks beautifully displayed, as you can see here. And they have several different exhibits. The one that was coming up was Elizabeth and Mary. It wasn't open when I was there, but it was to be next. I was there, it was Paddington they were celebrating. The Harleian collection at the British Library is the one that's of most interest to us as Oxfordians and to me personally. It is the collection of Robert and Edward Harley, the first and second Earls of Oxford, second creation. And the library was founded in 1704 when Robert Harley purchased more than 600 manuscripts from the collection of the antiquary Sir Simon D'Ewes. The collection was then expanded by his son Edward, whose close friends included Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope. In 1708, the scholar Humphrey Wanley one of the original members of the society, became the library keeper, and it was then sold to Great Britain for the amount £10,000, obviously much less than its current worth, under an act of parliament that also established the British Museum, and that's how we have access to it today. On Monday morning, August 23rd, I went to the reader registration room as soon as the library opened to get my card. I was very fortunate to have had the assistance of Nigel Hobbs in reader registration, with whom I corresponded between June and August pretty much weekly to try to determine when the library would reopen so that I could come and visit. The first manuscript I requested was the Harley manuscript, described in the catalog as the arms, honors, matches, and issues of the ancient and illustrious family of Vere, gathered out of history, records, and other monuments of antiquity by Percival Golding. While this particular manuscript includes lots of information about several generations of the family of the De Veres, the significance of it is that it is the source of one of the first known, or perhaps the first known reference to Oxford's burial at Westminster. The date of the manuscript, which is written in Golding's hand, is thought to be circa 1619. It's undated, and my task was to attempt to discern if in fact that date could be confirmed by the document and its contents. In the manuscript, Golding writes, Edward de Vere, only son of John, born the 12th day of April, and was Earl of Oxenford, High Chamberlain, Lord Bolbec, Sandford, and Bellesmere, Steward of the Forest in Essex, and of the Privy Council to the King's Majesty that now is, of whom I will only speak what all men's voices confirm. He was a man in mind and body, absolutely accomplished, with honorable endowments. He died at his house at Hackney in the month of June, Anno 1604, and lieth buried at Westminster. I transcribed the pages, took photos, and also requested scans from the library that I received after I returned. When I returned home, I worked with Bonner Miller Cutting to complete the transcription, analysis, and interpretation of the manuscript. I'm very grateful to Bonner for her assistance with this, and our conclusions, the transcription of the relevant pages, and our shared beliefs about the importance of this document will be published in next month's issue of the Shakespeare Oxford newsletter. There are several other 17th century literary references to Shakespeare being buried at Westminster. These are included in the forthcoming New Shakespeare Allusion book being compiled and edited by Alexander Waugh and Roger Strittmatter. These include the dedication page of the 1609 sonnets, as has been explained by Alexander in his many excellent YouTube videos, and late 17th century allusions by Samuel Shepherd, John Denham, Samuel Speed, and Jasper Mayne, among others. I spent 4 days in total at the British Library and examined and began transcribing several other documents. The library also houses several of the manuscripts from the Lansdowne collection of the Cecil family. So these include many letters to Lord Burleigh, letters from Oxford, and several letters from several of the poets and writers who made up Oxford Literary Circle. Letters from Thomas Nash, Don Antonio, Southampton, works by George Peele, John Lilly, Thomas Dekker, Henry Chettle, and Edward Allen. And here is the representation, the beautiful chart that Alexander Waugh has created that gives us a view of Oxford's world at this time from the years 1580 to 1591, when we believe that he had this group of writers working with and for him. And so that is really the purpose of my research. I am looking specifically for evidence that they were circulating manuscripts. They were, in fact, working together during this time period in London. So on to that end, on Wednesday, I went down to Dulwich College, just south of London. This is the college founded by Edward Allen, originally called the College of God's Gift. When I arrived, Netflix was filming a costume drama. So I had to use my filmmaker credentials. I managed to get through security and find my contact there, Mrs. Callista Lucy. And she is someone who I had the, again, pleasure of being introduced to by Alexandra Wall, who provided a reference for me to come and visit the archives. Unlike the libraries, this is a small archive with an adjacent office and just one large wooden desk. And I was left there alone. I didn't have to put my belongings in a locker and then everything that I wanted to bring with me in a plastic bag. But of course, I did use pencil. She was really helpful, bringing me the catalogs to cross-reference and sharing her own theories and research about Marlowe, Allen, and Henslowe. For example, she wonders why there's no, in the correspondence between Henslowe and Allen, there's never a mention of Marlowe's death. But of course, that was before Allen had retired and come back to Sussex, so perhaps it's because they would have talked about it. There was no reason to write about it. So she was really entertaining. I really enjoyed talking with her. I viewed Chapman's Orlando Furioso manuscript, as well as several other documents from Henslow's diaries and Allen's papers, which included work signed by Gabriel Harvey, George Gascon, and the signature purported to be in Marlowe's hand. The Orlando Furioso manuscript includes quite a bit of marginalia, as well as additions or interlineations thought to have been made by Henslowe, but these appear to be in several different hands. For example, comparing the hand of Henslow's diary with the Orlando Furioso editions, it does not seem to be the same hand, but that may not be definitive because, of course, individual handwriting does change over time. So I'm still working on my analysis of those documents. The manuscripts I viewed also included a statement of Chapman's debt to Henslowe in the hand of someone else, but signed by Chapman. And so here, again, supposed to be 1598, we can discern whose hand it is if that is in fact Chapman's signature. Here is an image of the college seal. And when I returned to London at Victoria Station, I couldn't resist the opportunity to have a late lunch with Shakespeare at the Shakespeare pub, where the walls are covered with quotes from the Bard and images that purport to be, you can see there's also his famous signature, all about Shakespeare. On Thursday morning, I took the train up to Oxford University and had breakfast on George Street. And I have to say, this is my first time visiting Oxford. Arriving early in the morning before the hordes of tourists that would later take over was really magical. It's really a beautiful city. Walking from the train, there were just a few students riding bicycles, so really just like out of a movie set. And of course, this is where they shot several of the Harry Potter films. You can almost hear the echo of the voices of the great many scholars who have studied there. There's another image, beautiful buildings. And for me personally, I've always loved libraries. They're spiritual places, sanctuaries, almost mystical. And the Bodleian collection of libraries comprises some of the best collections of manuscripts in the world. So it was really wonderful to have an opportunity. Now, in order to become a reader at the Bodleian, you have to take the pledge, which includes the promise that you will not light a candle in the library, nor will you smoke a pipe. So I did that from my hotel room over the phone before I left to go there. And I was accepted. And the manuscripts that I wanted to see are part of the special collections at the Weston Library building. So not one of the older ones, but this is a relatively modern one. These collections include poetry, not just by Edward de Vere, but by Nash, Heywood, Queen Elizabeth, and these are in several different hands. The poems by the Queen and Oxford are said to have been compiled by a Cambridge student. And here are some images of the Rawlinson manuscripts that I took a look at. Richard Rawlinson was born in 1690. His father, Sir Thomas Rawlinson, was a wine merchant and Lord Mayor of London. After being educated at St. Paul's, Richard Rawlinson matriculated at St. John's, Oxford. He got his BA in 1711, his MA in 1713, and then an honorary degree in 1719. And after completing his studies, he traveled to Holland, France, Germany, and Italy, where he amassed a huge collection of foreign classical and English books, as well as coins. And it's said that few book sales in London took place without his purchasing the manuscripts that were available. When his older brother Thomas died, he also was a great book collector. Rawlinson cataloged his manuscripts and then purchased them in 1734. So this is how we have many of the extant poems of Edward de Vere and other wonderful poetry available to view at the Bodleian. The manuscripts that I viewed included Thomas Heywood's The Art of Love, Thomas Nash's The Choice of Valentines, Gabriel Harvey's Complain We May, Much is Amiss, described in the catalog as a copy of an anonymous poem in small, neat secretary hand, the heading in Harvey's hand, followed by 5 lines in his hand beginning Who can persuade, where treason is above reason, headed Sir John Cheek, and subscribed with the signature Gabriel Harvey. So this is an interesting one that I would like to do more analysis of. In a quarto manuscript, partly drawn up by Gabriel Harvey, again, late 16th century. This is the description of that document. But the one that I was most interested in seeing was the Rawlinson number 85, Poetry 85. This is described as a quarto miscellany, chiefly of verse, largely in single secretary hand, compiled by a Cambridge student, 130 leaves. It's edited in Cummings, who suggests that the compiler was a Sir John Finett of Fordwich, Kent. Therefore, it's often referred to as the John Finett Miscellany. But it says here again in the catalog that the hands do not appear to be his. So this makes the attribution questionable. It includes several copies of poems by Edward de Vere, and these, of course, were recently republished in a volume by Roger Strittmatter, the poems of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. And of course, they are also in Katherine Chiljan's book, several of them. Katherine's book is Letters and Poems of Edward, Earl of Oxford. And one of the poems, the first poem in the manuscript, is by Queen Elizabeth, When I Was Fair and Young and Favor Graced Me. Also includes 2 Latin orations that she delivered at Cambridge University in 1564 and 1566, and poems by William Herbert, several by Philip Sidney, Edward Dyer, Edmund Spenser, George Peele, Walter Raleigh, Arthur Gorges, Henry Howard, Robert Devereux, Thomas Churchyard, and Nicholas Breton. So lots of poetry to view. And having finished my work at the Bodleian, I saw that they had high tea at Hertford College at Oxford. I just did the abbreviated version, scones with the local clotted cream and jam. It was really lovely. And I also was told don't miss Blackwell's bookstore, so I spent some time there. So if you have a chance to go to Oxford, it's really lovely. I would highly recommend it, and I'm excited to go back. My last day at the British Library was really the best because I had been waiting all week for a manuscript that someone else had out. And while I was there earlier in the week, I would try to discern who might be working with that manuscript. But of course, you really can't talk to people. So my spying didn't work. But when I was down at Dulwich, I called the library. And there again, I had the help of a person in the reader's room named Jeffrey, who put it aside for me when I explained my itinerary, that I was up at Oxford on Thursday and I'd be back on Friday, and he made sure that it was there for me on Friday morning. This was one of the high points, as I said, of my research, because in this volume I was able to read the letters from Oxford to Lord Burleigh. And I honestly felt connected with him in a way that I hadn't before, seeing the documents. And of course, as I said, these have been transcribed. They are included in Katherine Chiljan's book. They're also beautifully read by Derek Jacobi in a recording called Oxford's Letters that was put together by Stephanie Hopkins Hughes. But seeing the original document in his hand was really moving, particularly the lines about wanting to care for his own children. So in these two letters written to Burleigh in 1591, Oxford asks for assistance with his financial needs from Cecil and the Queen so that he might provide for his own children. And it's quite, as I said, an emotional plea for autonomy and respect. And I plan to do an analysis of these letters in the context of his financial state at that particular point in time. Here's an excerpt of one of the letters. "This is a thing I have been desirous to impart unto your lordship, but that I have either found you troubled with other duties, or I myself have been encumbered with the treacheries of Hamptons. The effect hereof is that I would be glad to have an equal care with your lordship over my children, and if you may obtain this reasonable suit of her majesty, granting me nothing but what she hath done to others and mean persons, and nothing but that shall pay for, then those lands which are in Essex, as Hedingham, Bretts, and the rest whatsoever." So here he's asking for the property that he can then derive income from, and specific amounts that he thinks he will be able to use to improve his financial condition. And he goes on to say, "And so much am I sure to make of these domains for myself, so shall my children be provided for, myself at length settled in quiet, and I hope your lordship contented, remaining no cause for you to think me an evil father, nor any doubt in me, but that I may enjoy that friendship from your lordship that so near a match and not fruitless may lawfully expect. Good my lord, think of this, and let me have both your furtherance and counsel in this cause, for to tell truth, I am weary of an unsettled life, which is the very pestilence that happens unto courtiers that propound to themselves no end of their time therein bestowed." On Saturday, I took the train up to Hatfield House to visit the Salisbury branch of the Cecil family. The old palace was hosting a wedding, but I was able to tour the new house with its collection of portraits, arms, jewelry, and of course books. Among the items on display at Hatfield was the map for Frobisher's journey, which of course was funded in part by Edward de Vere, with a notation by William Cecil on the back, and a map of South and Central America made in Venice, which was also owned by Lord Burleigh. And of course, the library at Hatfield House is almost as impressive as the one at Burleigh House. It includes more than 10,000 volumes dating from the 16th century. One interesting note about the visit was that it included a portrait of Robert Dudley that was added to the house on display for the Lord Burleigh 500th anniversary celebration. The guide explained that when asked if the portrait could stay on after the exhibit ended, Lord Salisbury apparently replied, "Absolutely not." The Hatfield House archives include more of de Vere's letters, which I hope to receive permission to view on my next visit. On my last night in London, I made a pilgrimage to the theater district. I had previously gone to Bishopsgate, but this night I went to the Savoy, where Oxford had his first school for writers, and I was able to get last-minute discount tickets for two productions, Constellations, a kind of metaverse meditation on life and love that featured 4 different pairs of actors on alternating nights, and a conversation that begins, stops, resets, and then is replayed in an alternate universe. I saw the 2 male leads, and it was very entertaining, quite short, only 70 minutes, so good for today's students with low attention spans. And then I saw the musical Everybody's Talking About Jamie. This was based on a documentary about a young man from the north of England who wants to go to his school prom wearing a dress. And after I returned to the United States, it was released here as a film version of the musical. there is the Savoy and the two shows. So the objective of my research, as I said, is to find evidence that, in fact, the manuscripts were circulated among and between the members of Oxford's literary circle. So my next documentary project will focus on this period in Oxford's life. And at this point, I am in the pre-production stage. So I am putting together the resources. I'm, looking into filming some in London and outside of London, again, based on the current restrictions. It is possible to start filming again. So I'm really excited about that. And I can say that, from the documents that I have seen, and again, have yet to completely analyze and have not transcribed all of yet, it does seem to me to confirm the theory that Alexander Waugh has put forth, that Oxford and his circle of writers were facing extreme financial difficulties in the 1590s. So I'm very excited about returning to London and then subsequently sharing more of my research with all of you in the near future. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward again, as I said, to sharing more with you.
Thank you, Cheryl. A great summary of your travels and discoveries in England, and so much more still needs to be figured out and found out and discovered. And it sounds like you had a lot of fun doing it too. So I'm hopeful that you'll be able to do that again soon, again, to demonstrate that what Alexander Waugh said, that all these writers in the early 50s had great financial issues, and how they dealt with them is a part of the mystery. Our next speaker is Jim Warren, and he is be talking about Shakespeare Revolutionized, his book, The First 100 Years of J. Thomas Looney's Advent, Shakespeare Identified. This is a very important book, and it reveals a great amount of time and research and scholarship that Jim has done. I don't know where you find the time, Jim. You must never sleep. It's just an amazing. And he has all these other books coming down the pipeline too. He has given presentations on this in many conferences, and he was named Shakespeare Oxfordian of the Year in the year 2020, the 100th anniversary of Looney's book, which is very appropriate. He's retired from the U.S. Foreign Service. He worked in Thailand for many years. Well, now he can devote full-time, 25 hours a day to research on Oxford. Here's Jim.
Well, thank you, John. Let me turn down the volume. All right. Well, it recently occurred to me that we're in the midst of a golden age for Oxfordian research and publishing, and we have been for some time. That idea occurred to me as I was looking through the lists of Oxfordian books that Alex McNeil ran in the fall issue of the Shakespeare Oxford newsletter. You've probably all seen these lists compiled by a dozen or so Oxfordian scholars. But note the dates of publication. Most are from the most recent decade. Like here's 2018, 2019, 2021, 2005, 2013. The point being that there's been such a flood of important publications during the last decade that calling it a golden age isn't an overstatement. And the flood isn't ending. Even more important Oxfordian books have come out since those lists were published, and still others are on the way. For instance, Stephanie Hopkins Hughes's long-awaited Educating Shakespeare will soon be released. Hank Whittemore has a new book coming out, The Living Record, which is a concise edition of the ideas in his The Monument. A second volume of the collections of Bronson Feldman's writings, edited by Warren Hope and published by Laugwitz Verlag in Germany, will soon be available. And as we heard earlier, Michael Delahoyde, in addition to the Oxfordian edition of Twelfth Night that came out recently, is working on Oxfordian editions of The Merchant of Venice and A Comedy of Errors. And of course, every issue of the Oxfordian under Gary Goldstein's editorship is chock full of important articles. Of special importance is Robert Pretzter's comprehensive list of every work written by Edward de Vere. together with discussions of why the pieces on the list are included and why others aren't. Now, it could be that not everyone will agree with all of Bob's decisions, but that's beside the point. That we now have in hand a list that can be discussed and debated is a development of the greatest importance for the Oxfordian movement. But all this thinking about the current golden age got me thinking about another golden age, a period of only 7 years, 1928 to 1934, in which some 24 important Oxfordian books were published. Again, that's 24 important Oxfordian books in only 7 years. I want to show you a list of them. Here it is in chronological order. You can see that in that brief period of time, there's important books by Captain Bernard Ward, Percy Allen, Gerald Rendell, Gilbert Slater, Ava Turner Clark, and several others. Now, it's these books, together with the two that John Thomas Looney published early in the 1920s, that formed the foundation of the Oxfordian thesis. Yet most of these books are little known today, even by Oxfordian scholars, the reason being that they're out of print. They're available only in expensive and hard to find first editions, or in what are essentially bound photocopies, which are also expensive. I became familiar with these books through the research I did to write this book, Shakespeare Revolutionized, the one that John showed you earlier, my history of much of the Oxfordian movement over the past century. In reading them, I learned many important things about the Oxfordian idea that I hadn't known before and that have been lost to history. The evidence in support of Edward de Vere's authorship is far stronger than most people today, even most Oxfordians, realize, because they aren't familiar with those early books. So I decided to bring these books back into print. I've spent the last 6 months and will spend the next year preparing new editions of many of them. Over the coming year, I'll bring back into print more than 20 books and booklets and more than 130 articles first published from 1920 to 1945. So here's the same list with the works in blue, those that I will bring back into print over the coming year. You can see it's about 2/3 or 3/4 of those published during that earlier golden age. But now these books will be issued in editions that are scholarly yet reader-friendly, like what I did for Looney's Shakespeare Identified, this book, a few years ago. They'll have modern typesettings with annotations and footnotes and bibliographies and indexes to make them as informative as possible. Now, here's what a sample page, typical page, looks like. I think it looks beautiful, and I'm hoping that readers will agree. Okay, but one of the most important things about these books is that each volume will have an extensive introductory essay explaining the context in which the works were originally written, why they were important at that time, and why they're still important today. First to be released will be a 7-volume set of the complete Shakespeare writings of Percy Allen, the most important Oxfordian scholar after Looney himself. So those 7 volumes include Allen's 9 books. This is what they look like in their first editions. 5 shorter works, pamphlets or booklets, and more than 120 articles, grouped mostly chronologically. And those will all come out at the same time in the summer, hopefully in June. Then in the fall, I will bring out Gerald Rendell's 2 books on Shakespeare sonnets and poems in 1 volume. Shakespeare Sonnets and Edward de Vere, his first book from 1930, and Personal Clues in Shakespeare Sonnets and Poems and Sonnets from 1933 or 34. Again, those are coming out in 1 volume. And at the same time, I'll issue another volume on Shakespeare's handwriting and the play Sir Thomas More. Now, in recent discussions on this subject, even Oxfordians have made no mention of 3 important books on it, 3 books that I think are the definitive word on the subject. So I'm bringing them back into print in 1 volume. And these books are Sir George Greenwood's Shakespeare Signatures and Sir Thomas More, Greenwood's Shakespeare's Handwriting and the Northumberland Manuscript, and Gerald Rendell's Shakespeare's Handwriting and Spelling, all in 1 volume. And then at the end of the year, I'll issue a new version of Gilbert Slater's Seven Shakespeares, a very important book from 1931 that discusses 7 people who could have, for whom a solid claim could be made that they were Shakespeare. In the end, he concludes that it was Edward de Vere who was Shakespeare, but he has very interesting things to say about each of the others. Then about a year from now, I'll put out a new edition of Captain Bernard M. Ward's The 17th Earl of Oxford. This is a work of the greatest importance, not only for the information in it that Captain Ward uncovered about Edward de Vere and literary life during the Elizabethan era, but also for its place in the Oxfordian movement. After several slow years in the mid-1920s, this book jump-started the movement early in 1928, just as Charlton Ogburn's The Mysterious William Shakespeare did at the end of 1984. Now let's return to Percy Allen and the 7 volumes of his complete writings on Shakespeare that I'll bring out in June. All right, here's a summary list of the contents of each of the 7 volumes. So you can see, for instance, that the first volume includes 2 books, 1 pamphlet, and some articles. These are all of his writings on Shakespeare before he became a publicly announced Oxfordian. So they're his pre-Oxfordian writings on Shakespeare. And then the others are basically in chronological order until his final works in volume 7. Now, although Allen is most often recalled as an outspoken proponent of Edward de Vere's authorship of Shakespeare's works, he actually made contributions in many areas of Shakespeare studies apart from the authorship issue. I've identified 6 major thrusts of his work, 3 related to understanding the plays and poems apart from the question of authorship, and 3 others that address the authorship issue directly. And here's a slide showing summaries of them. On the Shakespeare studies side, Allen identified topical influences on the dramatist that other Shakespeare scholars of his time had misunderstood or overlooked, thereby deepening understanding of the plays and shedding light on obscure passages in them. He also documented just how deeply Shakespeare's fellow dramatists and poets, especially Ben Jonson, George Chapman, and Edmund Spenser, were influenced by and copied his works. And Allen showed just how widely the Elizabethan mindset differed from modern ways of thinking and demonstrated that an informed imagination, an imagination informed by accurate historical knowledge of the earlier period, is necessary to understand the Elizabethans and their literature. On the authorship side, Allen strengthened the evidence in support of Edward de Vere's authorship in many important ways, including ways that many Oxfordian scholars are unaware of today. I'll have more to say about that in just a moment. He also introduced and developed what has become known as the dynastic succession theory, sometimes called the Prince Tutor theory, that explains why de Vere published under a pseudonym and how such a deception could have succeeded at that time and for hundreds of years thereafter. And he recorded far more extensively than anyone else the activities of those active in the Oxfordian movement, the growing influence of the Oxfordian idea, and the response to it by Orthodox scholars during the first wave of the movement during the 1920s and 30s and the first half of the 1940s. These 6 major thrusts of Allen's work reinforce each other and are in fact so intertwined that it becomes impossible to study any one of them without also examining the others. His writings on Shakespeare really do constitute one big work spread out over 2 decades. That's why I'm publishing all of his Shakespeare work and releasing all 7 volumes at the same time. Now, in examining the ways that Allen's work strengthened support for the idea of Oxford's authorship, I identified 9 distinct lines of evidence. In my introductions, I show that Allen contributed much to strengthening the 5 lines of evidence that other Oxfordian scholars had launched before he began his work. But what is most important is that Allen launched and developed 4 new lines of evidence, 3 of which are largely forgotten today. One of those lines was his showing that other dramatists of the time, including Jonson, Chapman, and Spenser, often alluded in their plays and poems to Edward de Vere, to Shakespeare, and to de Vere as Shakespeare. References that were largely unknown or unrecognized for what they were before Allen pointed them out. This was a discovery of the greatest importance and one largely forgotten today. I'll give you one example from this line of evidence. In his earlier books, Allen had shown that having knowledge of the Elizabethan era would help scholars and readers today understand Shakespeare's plays and those of other playwrights better. He continued to make that claim in his fourth book, but also made the reverse claim that the plays themselves can teach us much about developments in the society in which they were written. In his interpretation, many passages in the plays of Johnson and Chapman depict events that happened in real life for which no documentary evidence is known to exist. Without this literary evidence, we would not know that they had occurred. One example is the scene in Johnson's Every Man Out of His Humor that in Allen's interpretation depicts an interaction between Edward de Vere, William Shakespeare, and Queen Elizabeth. Historical records provide no evidence that Shakespeare ever met the other two. Allen interprets the passage as depicting Oxford presenting William Shakespeare to Queen Elizabeth under the guise that he is a gentleman who is such an accomplished actor that he can portray even yeomen convincingly. She's fooled at first, then realizes she has been put on, and responds as Mother Nature does in those commercials for chiffon margarine, in which she's been fooled into believing that the margarine is her delicious creamy butter. Remember those commercials where she says, "It's not nice to fool Mother Nature"? Well, Elizabeth's response is similar. I want to read to you Allen's description of that passage so that you can get the full flavor of how he presents his findings. If my identification of Johnson's characters is correct, Allen writes, it follows that we have here one of the most enthralling and enlightening scenes in the whole range of topical burlesque in Elizabethan drama. Namely, the man of Stratford himself, whose acquisition of a coat of arms and laborious ramping to gentility have been mocked at in an earlier scene, brought before Queen Elizabeth herself as a scholar, a linguist, and as a gentleman. He is further described to the Queen by Oxford as, in addition and transcending all, an actor of consummate ability who doth so perfectly imitate any manner of person for gesture, action, passion, or whatever, including among his best imitations, that of a rustic or clown, done so closely to life that no keenest observer can find the sparks of a gentleman in him. Keen satire indeed is Allen's comment. So if Allen had indeed pierced through the cover story to the real life events depicted underneath, he has presented new historical information not recorded elsewhere, that a meeting between the Queen and Shakespeare actually took place, and that it was known to Johnson and presumably others in the theater world. So this is only one of the scores of passages in the plays of Johnson, Chapman, and Spencer that in Allen's interpretation depict real life events, many of them relating to the authorship of Shakespeare's works. So given the importance of Allen's Shakespearean writings, how did it come about that his books and pamphlets soon went out of print and his articles and reviews were never collected until now? Part of the answer lies in the onset of the Second World War in the second half of 1939 and the crushing burden it placed on England for the following 6 years, and in fact, even for a decade beyond. Another factor was Orthodox scholars' resistance to the idea of Edward de Vere's authorship. So eager were they to defeat the Oxfordian idea that when it came to Allen and his works, they threw out the baby with the bathwater. Better, in their minds, to suppress all of Allen's work than to try to preserve his writings on Shakespeare's works in ways unrelated to the authorship question, which might have led inquisitive scholars to discover and consider his evidence in support of de Vere's authorship. Such a discovery would, in fact, have been inevitable because the 6 principal thrusts of Allen's work, as I pointed out, were so tightly interwoven that considering any of them must lead to considering all of them. They come as one package. Take it all or bury it all were the only options, and they chose the latter. Many Oxfordians, too, were eager to bury Allen and his work to escape an idea they found repugnant and which they believed could harm the Oxfordian cause, whether it was true or not. This is the dynastic succession theory. The idea that the Virgin Queen and Edward de Vere had a liaison from which resulted a son who became known as the third Earl of Oxford was simply beyond the pale for the people who ran the Shakespeare Fellowship in the decades after the war ended. They too were willing to throw the baby out with the bathwater to escape being charged with tarnishing the reputation of the Virgin Queen. Even in combination, though, those factors might not have been sufficient to bury Allen and his work had he not given them a shovel. In the early 1940s, Allen was using a spiritualist medium to communicate with his deceased twin brother. He went on, he believed, to connect with the spirits of Edward de Vere, Sir Francis Bacon, and William Shakespeare. Once his plans to publish a book of transcripts of his conversations with them became known to trustees of the Shakespeare Fellowship early in 1946, Allen was forced from the presidency of the organization. Quickly and almost completely, he became, to the fellowship's leadership, a non-person, and in their view, an embarrassment to the organization and the Oxfordian cause. Better to cut all ties to him, they thought, than to subject their organization and the Oxfordian cause to ridicule. And so the work of the greatest Oxfordian scholar and greatest spokesman for the Oxfordian idea during the critical decade of the 1930s was lost, until now. With the upcoming publication of my 7-volume collection of Allen's complete writings on Shakespeare, his revolutionary ideas about Shakespeare's plays and the effect they had on other dramatists and poets of the time, and his launching 4 new lines of evidence in support of de Vere's authorship, 3 of them now forgotten, will once again be readily available. In sum, the evidence in support of the Oxfordian claim is far stronger than most Oxfordians today realize, because so much of what was uncovered in the earlier Golden Age from 1928 to 1934 has been forgotten. My hope is that bringing the works of Allen and other early Oxfordians back into print will dramatically increase the evidence that can be cited in support of Edward de Vere as the principal author of Shakespeare's works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for your extensive and exhaustive historical research you have on the early years of the Oxfordian movement and how controversial that has been and still is to this day. But this is something we all need to know, and I thank you again for resurrecting that information so we can all be aware of it. I think we have a little time here. Maybe I can go back to a couple of questions because we have like 10 more minutes before we have the 45-minute break. And just do a couple of questions before we pass it on to the break and Don. So one question I have, I guess, is to Katherine. Somebody asked, what happened to Charles I's copy of the first folio? Is Katherine still available? Do we know whatever happened to the copy that Charles I had of the first folio?
Hi, John.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know that information.
Okay, well, that's something that I was curious. When that question came up, I was curious myself whatever happened to the royal copies of the first folio. Okay, no problem. And as a separate, not a question but an observation from Alexander Wall concerning Michael's talk on the Merchant of Venice. He said that he found that somebody related to him that they found a portrait of Portia at Villa Foscari, which is where she was located at. So it kind of corroborates that Villa Foscari was the location of Portia's place. Any comments, Michael?
I have not gotten there. I've got to go back. I'm sure that's the way Oxford felt when he had to leave. I got to get back to this place.
I hope you do. Because that's a significant discovery if that proves out to be correct. Yeah. And Cheryl, you had some questions that you were responding to. I think one from Alexander Wall also. You want to address those questions and your response.
Sure. I wanted to add to Michael's point that we did film outside the palace, Malcontenta, but we were not able to film inside that day. But my production coordinator, Deborah Cesana, does know the current occupant of the palace, the palazzo, so it might be possible to get inside. That would be wonderful. I was very disappointed that we could not get inside there, but I can put you in touch with her if you would like. So yes, to Alexandra's question about, I think his question was about the water rats, which was previously the Pindar of Wakefield. It was the Pindar, the person who caught stray animals and impounded them. That was the name of the original pub that was across the street, built in 1517, and then that was destroyed in a thunderstorm. It was rebuilt on the opposite side of the street, where next to my hotel now. And another interesting fact about that building was that it was once patronized by both Lenin and Karl Marx, who apparently boarded in the room above the pub. So just a little bit of history there. Thanks for asking.
Okay, thank you. And there are other questions, more technical, about the list of books that Jim mentioned. People want to have a list of those books that you went over too quickly for them, so we can have that information later on for them. I think those are the main questions that I have that I saw. And at this point, we can take a break until 3:15 Eastern Daylight Time. We'll take a break, and you can now use the chat. The chat should work between you guys, and then we'll meet back again with Don Rubin, who'll be hosting the second portion of the symposium. So thank you all, and have a nice break now from symposium. Talk to you later.